Hello and welcome. My name is Hermendra Ray and I will be your host for this TLC session. We are excited that you have joined us today for a Gleaning from the Friendly Orange Glow, Lessons in Online Learner Equity from the PLATO System. Please welcome Dr. Joshua Reichard.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's morning in Pacific time. I'm on the East Coast in Youngstown, Ohio. I want to thank you for joining me today. I have a little bit of an unusual session to share with you. I hope you enjoy it, though, and learn a few things about the history of our industry and profession that might be relevant to serving students today. So just a little introduction. I serve in my day-to-day work as the Vice President for Academic Affairs and a superintendent for an urban multicultural network of K-12 schools in Northeast Ohio. And we primarily serve students who are in poverty and meet federal poverty guidelines. In fact, we're in a city that's been ranked one of the highest concentrations of children living in poverty per capita in the United States. So it's a challenging job, but very rewarding as well. I've been teaching with Ashford University in the Forbes School of Business and Technology since 2013, and I've been involved in online learning in one form or another for almost 20 years now. In fact, I have a background in computer science, and I developed a very early learning management system around the turn of the millennium, and that's actually still in use by another institution today. So my academic work is mostly in the social sciences and, of course, educational leadership as well. Today, I want to share with you about a platform that most people don't even know existed. And it was called the PLATO platform, which began in 1960, and it was the first computer-based educational system in history. And it had some pretty remarkable technologies that most of us don't even realize existed 50, almost 60 years ago. We're talking about an instructional technology system that had multiplayer games, complex instructional strategies, and a worldwide network with thousands of terminals. And yet most of us don't realize that all of this existed before the internet. A little bit of personal information. I did my PhD at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. This was the first anti-apartheid university in South Africa. It was the first to accept students from any race. And Bishop Desmond Tutu was the chancellor at UWC for many years. Interestingly enough, UWC was the only university on the continent of Africa who was connected to the PLATO network and used PLATO courseware from the 1970s all the way into the 1990s by the time Nelson Mandela became president. So in today's session, we're going to examine the historical developments of this PLATO learning system and use it to critique modern approaches to instructional design in online learning with the goal of reducing transactional distance for learner equity. And then we're going to try to correlate some of those approaches to improving learner equity and engagement in our modern Canvas platform. So what was PLATO? PLATO is an acronym that stands for Programmed Logic for Automatic Teaching Operations, and it was invented in the 1960s, in fact, 1960 to be specific, by a team at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And what's interesting is this didn't emerge out of Silicon Valley. There effectively was not such a thing yet, at least it wasn't known as such. But a young electrical engineer named Donald Bitzer and others had a vision for a worldwide network of computers that would enable people to learn anytime and anywhere. And so this was conceived decades before the emergence of the public internet. And its innovation is really quite extraordinary. In this picture, you can actually see why it's called the friendly orange glow. The PLATO terminals had an orange plasma display, and get this, it was high-resolution graphics and it had a touch interface. So we're talking about the early 70s when these terminals emerged, but it had a touch interface, much like our modern mobile devices and tablets, and high-resolution graphics, which was just absolutely extraordinary for the technological limitations at the time. So this is a historical placard at the University of Illinois that recognizes the birth of computer-based education. As you can imagine, at Ashford University, we are contemporary heirs of that lineage and heritage. And Plato, in many ways, laid the groundwork to enable us to do what we're doing today in the ways that we're serving students through our modern platforms using the internet. But by the 1970s, Plato actually had forms of email, news groups, computer-based messaging, and threaded discussions, much like we use in Canvas. And Plato offered instruction on about 100 subjects to students all over the world, including in South Africa, as I mentioned earlier. So you would see screens like this with programmed lessons and high-resolution graphics, and many of those were interactive. But what was interesting is that the Plato platform was built on behaviorist educational theory. So B.F. Skinner was actually one of the contributing theorists to the idea behind computer-based education, which was effectively programmed learning. So they would design lessons and they would be self-paced and students would work through them and answer questions at the end. As innovative as this was, we're actually going to critique that approach in today's session and try to learn from some of the mistakes of the past as well. So I'd like to do a quick poll. I'm going to do 5 of these throughout the session. Let's see. I would like to ask the first question, and you can rate this as either too structured or not structured enough. Expectations for assignments in the courses I teach at Ashford are either too structured or not structured enough. Hopefully everyone can see the poll now in the session. Pull up the chat box just to make sure there are no technical problems with polling. Okay, great. Oh, it looks like all of the polls are showing at once. That's okay too. Okay, I'll leave that up. Oh, great. Thank you. The results are coming in. I'll let that go. But interestingly, it looks like we're pretty well split down the middle in terms of our response to this question. Recently, an engineer named Brian Deere compiled a series of stories about the Plato terminal and experience in the book entitled The Friendly Orange Glow. And I read this recently because of my interest in computer science and computer-based education, and of course my work here at Ashford University. And it's what inspired this session today. But Mark Andreessen, who is one of the co-founders of Netscape, one of the earliest and most popular web browsers, said this: a full decade before the history most people believe, Plato was the original system that inspired modern computing and even the cloud. Designed and built by Midwestern pioneers starting in 1960, Plato was still operational when I attended the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the 1990s. In fact, I took math classes on it before building Mosaic. This story is a testament to the importance of both innovation and timing. And I think these innovation in particular in higher education is one of Ashford University's missional values. What was interesting about Plato is that some of the problems related to instructional design were actually solved early on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that we continue to struggle with today. And Deere says this in the text, that today's online educators seem to have punted on the issue of instructional design. Instead of being creative in this area and really trying to meet the needs of learners, we tend to plop a video camera down in front of the lecture hall and toss it on YouTube. This became the new definition of courseware after 2010, and lots of big universities have published their courseware as publicly accessible through MOOCs and other things. But what he says is that they're starting from scratch. Today, most educators have never heard of PLATO or know that anything that powerful could have existed before many of them were born. And there's some very interesting dialogue with the founders of Coursera, some executives from the University of Phoenix, for example, who have never heard of PLATO and never knew that it existed. Deere says this also, there's so much history here and interesting stories about innovation and early examples of pretty much everything we take for granted today, and yet none of this has ever been known in the mainstream. The topic I'd like to focus on, and what I think we can learn most from PLATO, is the issue of transactional distance. And this is something I care deeply about when serving students in our online classrooms. The bottom line is that distance is not geographic. So even though we're doing online learning and effectively the old term of distance learning, it's not the geography that makes it distant or not. The reality is that the looser the structure of an adult learning situation, the greater distance between the learner and the learning process itself. Any kind of formal education requires both structure and interaction for the learner. And the goal is to have high structure and high interaction, which will reduce a sense or a feeling of distance from the learner and the educational process itself. So an early theorist, Moore in 1973, stated this in terms of structure and dialogue. So dialogue is educator-learner bidirectional communication. Most often for us, that's in the form of the Canvas inbox or email or threaded discussions. And structure is the adaptability of instructional components and methodology to the needs of the learner. So what we need to aim for, because most of us at Ashford, we're serving adult learners, most of them are in the middle of their careers, many of them are military personnel, many of them are trying to advance professionally. Our goal is to provide both ample structure and ample interaction to help them succeed. This is an interesting flow chart from the early conceptions of the PLATO system. This was probably designed maybe even before 1960 in the late 1950s. But what they envisioned was a learning system where students would be learning information at a terminal. But notice on this diagram that, number one, the student plays a very important role in the flow chart, which we don't see very often today. They actually took the time to represent the student as a central figure in the diagram. And notice also that the computer is as far away as possible from the learner. I think this is really important and insightful because the early designers of PLATO recognized that sometimes the technology can inhibit the learning process. And so one of our goals, I think, in online education is to try to hide the technical hurdles and protect the learner from technical hurdles as much as possible. So I see that you've already completed the polls. And on this one, I think everyone, the majority seems to agree that courses are designed to be student-centered at Ashford, but not strongly agree. So I often tell teachers in my school system that you don't have to be bad to get better. So that's our goal, is to continuously improve the student-centeredness of our courses. So what I think PLATO can teach us is that the effort to distance the learner from the metal, and what I mean by the metal is the actual technical mediation, whether that's Canvas or an app on their mobile device, from the actual process of learning whatever it is we're teaching through the online platform. That's ultimately the goal. The more we can help the learner reduce a feeling of transactional distance, the more success and satisfaction and engagement I think the learner will feel. So for me, this is an issue of learner equity. and to ensure that every learner in our classrooms gets the best experience. I think we need to weave both personalized and whole class learning into the rhythm of our weekly activities. So whole class learning are things like our instructor guidance, answers on the Ask Your Instructor forum, clarification on assignments, and personalized our discussion replies, individual emails, and constructive assignment feedback. What's also interesting about the PLATO platform is that those early behaviorist, Skinner-inspired lessons on the terminals were not enough. Students sat down and studied chemistry or biology or math or whatever it was at the terminal, and something was lacking. There was high structure. The courses were tightly programmed, but there was insufficient dialogue. The users or the learners wanted to interact and support one another. So they effectively hacked the PLATO system in the form of what were called notes files to create threaded discussions before there were ever such things in technological terms. They were effectively invented by students on the PLATO platform. And I think that tells us something about human nature, that, that students want meaningful interaction with one another and with their instructor. Most of us know that the U.S. Department of Education is tightly regulating this matter, especially with regards to federal student loans. So they want online universities to ensure that we provide substantive interaction. And they say that that is, might include, but is not limited to, direct instruction, substantive feedback and assessments, or as described above, contacts with students that create the opportunity for relevant discussion of academic subject matter. And that language is from the U.S. Department of Education. So what emerged out of PLATO was actually a application that students themselves wrote for PLATO called Talkomatic, which was a real-time discussion forum. What was interesting about Talkomatic is that, unlike today, when we see ellipses when someone's typing a message to us, or in the case of a Canvas discussion, we don't see it at all because it's asynchronous, Talkomatic actually showed every keystroke in real time. And that level of interaction was really interesting because it was much more synchronous and gave the feeling of a face-to-face conversation in ways that I think threaded discussions don't quite get the job done today, and even in Canvas. So what we're aiming for is enhancing our classrooms within the structures that we have to ensure that we provide strong opportunities for dialogue and strong structure to our courses. The more that the adult learners know the expectations and those expectations are clear, and the more we interact with them, the more likely they will be to succeed. So you've already answered this. I'm glad to see that the majority strongly agrees that at Ashford we ask provocative questions in the discussion forum. I have a couple of just words of advice that I think are common sense, and most of us that have been teaching online for a while know. But the learning about the history of PLATO just caused me to reflect on these issues a little more deeply. So number one, clarify your assignments through guidance. Try to use your guidance as a constructive tool, not just a requirement for compliance with the university's expectations. So ensure that your expectations for every course assignment is clear. Provide recommended outlines and templates for assignments. I think that's one of the things in terms of structure that students appreciate most when we provide them templates. So for example, that helps them overcome some of the barriers of APA style if we can provide them with a template for the weekly assignments. And lastly, don't overload them with resources, but provide them with sufficient support. Most of them are struggling to manage their time as it is, and it can actually be iatrogenic to the learning process if we overload them with too much information outside of the assigned reading. Number two, and this is on the dialogue end, is to actively engage in discussion forums. And of course, the Ashford gives us some goals to aim for in our evaluations, but certainly replying personally to the forums weekly, at least 6 over a 3-day span, is the minimum. reply as early as possible, and maybe before Thursday if you can, so that students have plenty of time to read your responses and reply to them and engage in the forum. And encourage original thought, not repetition. Unfortunately, some of the prompts tend to be repetitive, and students just cite the same section of the textbook, and everyone's effectively writing the same response. That's not helpful, and oftentimes the students are not learning much through that process. So what I try to do is encourage them to apply it directly to their work situation or their career goals, so that each post is unique and different, and we can learn from each other in a synergetic way. And of course, lastly, asking provocative questions. What if, how does, what is the difference between, how often do you suppose, and so on and so forth. Number 3, I hope everyone has started using Inspire for faculty engagement from within Canvas. This is a very useful tool, and it has helped me quite a bit to communicate with the students by email, to encourage them to get involved and engage with the course. And I've actually been able to watch that metric change day to day and week to week as I use the tool and identify students that I need to reach out to. It's very helpful. So it looks like we've already replied to this question, and most of us are using it weekly, if not daily, which is great. And the last question I asked, just because I'm curious, emailing students using Inspire improves student engagement. Everyone agrees with that. I think that's helpful. I did receive an email once back from a student saying they didn't realize they were doing anything wrong. And I use that as an opportunity to just encourage them and offer support and help. So I think it's important that they see that that's not a punitive measure, but one where we're trying to help them to succeed. And lastly, providing comprehensive feedback is one of the best ways that you can personalize the experience for the students. So try your best to annotate documents from within Waypoint and provide high quality narrative feedback on those assignments that's relevant to the student's situation and their needs. And return assignments as early as possible. I know the deadline is Sunday, but sometimes those assignments are cumulative and students are building on them week to week. So the sooner we can return those, I think, the better. So with that said, I think that some of these insights from the history of computer-based education and the PLATO platform in particular can help us in meeting learner needs today. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. Number 2, learner equity is about reducing students' feeling of transactional distance, which is not geographic. It's the learner's perception of separation from the learning process itself. And we know that Canvas does have some useful tools to help us reduce students' feeling of transactional distance from the learning process. And that's for us an aspect of continuous improvement, where we can always do our part to make our courses better and more engaging and more student-centered for the sake of their success and satisfaction. And lastly, Dialog is the best way to reduce transactional distance. So like PLATO, we can have very, very structured courses, but if the students don't feel like there's sufficient dialogue and personalized interactive support from us, their instructors, and from their peers, the learning process is going to be incomplete at best. So I think one of the most important things we can do is encourage that regular and substantive interaction. So thank you for joining me today. I appreciate everyone who is in attendance. And if you have any questions, you can send those into the chat box. I think we have just a few more minutes left in the session. I see Stacy said, it's an interesting point. There often seems to be increased encouragement to add more metal, apps, multiple systems, third party, in our courses. As we do, students often struggle with learning these programs and systems and mastering content within the 5-week accelerated format. What solutions would you suggest for that as we consider how courses may be revised in the future? I think that's an excellent question, Stacy, and it's interesting for me because of my background in K-12 education as well. We tend to chase after the latest fads in educational technology. And so schools are always under pressure to adopt the latest apps, the latest tools, the latest gimmicks. And in my experience over the last decade, those things come and go. And that's not to say that they are not useful. They are in many cases, but you cannot stake your claim on them. I think some of these strategies are timeless. So the idea of threaded discussions, I don't think is going anywhere. I think this is a timeless strategy for learning, for peer-to-peer learning and instructor-student interaction. So I think we would be best served at learning to really master that process and make it as meaningful and constructive as possible before layering on more technological hurdles, as you rightly note. Now, video interaction such as a Zoom meeting or a Google Hangout, I do that in the last week of most of my courses to help with the final assignment. Students really appreciate that, and most of them don't have a lot of technical difficulty in using it. But I think if we get really good at the central technologies and master those, I think we'll get the most return on our investment. So thank you. That's very insightful. Does anyone else have any comments? Okay, well, if not, thank you very much for joining me in this session today, and I hope it was meaningful to you and useful as you continue to serve students here at Ashford University. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshua Reichard, for a great presentation and for all of you joining in this session today. Enjoy the rest of TLC.